Okay, so obviously the first thing we need, whether a 2D game or a 3D game, is just to open up the scene that we will render our game in. So let's go ahead and do that for a 2D and a 3D game, and go over the steps for that. And hopefully by the end of this video, well, it might be a couple videos long. I'm going to try to keep them under 10 minutes, but definitely under 15 minutes each. So it might be a couple videos. And hopefully by the end of this first one, you'll be able to open the renderer for both the 2D and 3D version and get a sense of what this playlist is going to be about, how we're going to go about approaching game development. Because we're not going to make just a single game. What I'm wanting to make is something reusable, kind of our own method of interfacing with parts from these game engines that we can use over and over and over again, that can just be built up over time. Right? Every time we make a game, we just add a feature to our interface so that we can use it over and over and over again. Hopefully that'll make more sense by the end of this first video, so let's go ahead and get started and make a folder to put everything in. I don't have a good name yet, so I'm going to start by calling it my PyGame. And hopefully I'll think of a better name before too long. But the idea is going to be customization. So I'm going to use names that make sense, which is a big point along the way. Names that make sense to me. And that way I don't have to go look stuff up on the API or struggle to try to remember what some other programmer called it when they put the engine together. Any methods, like, for example, the method on how to move the player would be what I would name a method to move the player. So there's no struggle at all at trying to remember it. So kind of put something like that together, and then so really it's putting my name, the way I name things, onto that game, is in the game engine. So you'll definitely want to be using names that make sense to you. It'll make it a lot easier to remember. So we have a folder to put things in. So let's start with a 2D game. Well, we have PyGame, so I'm going to go and import PyGame. And just to open the window, there's a couple things we need. And so we'll call the PyGame library.init. And obviously there's different ways to import this. This isn't really a Python tutorial. I'm assuming people know Python. If you don't want to type PyGame over and over again, remember we could also do from PyGame import everything, import all. And when we do it that way, we don't have to type the reference name over and over again. But to keep things straight, I'm going to go ahead and use PyGame to start with. But before long, I'm probably going to start using that from notation for importing to avoid typing these things over and over and over again. But as you will see very soon, we're going to have the computer do this typing. So I'm going to go ahead and save this so that it starts changing colors, because that can be helpful. Let's see where I'm at. Libraries, documents, game dev in Python, my PyGame. So this will be test 2 for the 2D one to kind of start stuff. So we initialize it, and then we're going to need we'll want to know how fast to move our engine. So I'm going to put it on something called clock and set that to a value of pygame.time.clock. And what we feed in here is the number of frames per second. So here in a moment, when we get down to our loop, we're going to say do this 60 times a second. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do the loop. That's another thing about coding is if you're used to looking at examples, you're seeing a finished product. And our brains don't work the same way the computer needs it to process it. So when I'm coding, I do a lot of jumping back and forth and put it together the way my mind works. And the final version just has to be in a certain order for the computer. So we need an infinite loop to just run the whole time. Right? We could just write while true. Whoops, I just realized I saved that incorrectly. Let me go back and change that. Save as, that shouldn't be a text file, that should be test2.py. I'll save it as a Python script. Go ahead and get rid of that text file. So we need an infinite loop because we just want this loop to keep running until we close the game. But we could still go ahead and work in a graceful shutdown. And so I'm just going to set a variable called playing to true. And so while playing, that's the same as just saying while true at this point. And the first thing we want to put in here is our event listeners, which is fairly typically done just in a for loop. Remember, in Python, our for loops are what we call for each loops everywhere else. So for each event in PyGame.event.get. So we'll get all of the events PyGame knows about and then just loop through them. So I guess the first one's going to be a graceful shutdown. Might as well start with that. If event.type, and all of them, we'll just do an if statement to check. If our event.type is equal to PyGame.quit constant, so all uppercase letters, well, then we can set that Boolean that controls our loop to false. So that's when we'll assign false to that Boolean and be ready to end. So come down a little ways, and after we end the loop, we just want to call pygame.quit. Pygame.quit method. So the event type is quit, all in uppercase letters for the constant, and then the method is, well, has parentheses and is all lowercase. The graceful shutdown at the end. And while we're here in the loop, how often are we going to run the loop, right? Typically games don't run at the full speed of the machine. We want to set something. So the very last line in the loop, I'm going to set the clock. That's what kind of worked it, led down to this. Set how fast it's going. So I'm going to do clock, then call the .tick method, and pass in the frames per second. So I'll just go with 60 frames per second. That's a good speed anymore. So we're initializing our game, and we have our loop started. We're listening for the quint event, which is when we hit the little X. We'll see that in a moment. And we're just going to run through our loop 60 times every second. So now there's a couple more things we need to initialize. Well, really, we just need to see the screen. So we can set up a screen size, and I'm going to go with 768, 512. I picked those numbers because they're both divisible by 64, which means we can use several different pixel sizes to set up grids. 16, 32, 64 tile size, basically. And as a rule of thumb for PyGame, anytime you have more than one number, anything that's going to take more than one number, PyGame is going to want that as a tuple, which, remember, is an immutable list. So it's like a list. We access it with the square brackets and everything, but we can't change it. Once we set it what it is, it's a tuple is like carving those numbers in stone. So anytime we have more than one number, PyGame is going to want that as a tuple. So that gives us our screen size, and now we can go ahead and create a reference to our actual screen, or maybe I'll call it scene. Call it scene, and that's going to be pygame.display set mode, and then pass in that screen size that we created. And I guess this is just a pet peeve of mine. It bothers me tremendously to have a window open without a label on it. So I always go ahead and do pygame.display set caption as well. my PyGame. Yeah, I'll just put that. Call it the name of the folder because we're going to change this very shortly. Probably in the next video because we're already up to this much time. So that should be enough to go ahead and initialize this game. So I'm going to navigate to this folder, copy the directory, then set the location to that directory where that's at, call Python, and run test2.py. And check for typos because I was talking the whole time I was typing. Oh, yep, I missed a, that's in a if statement, so I missed a semicolon. Give that another try. There we go. That opened our window. That's all it takes to open the PyGame window. And the quit method is when we hit the X. Then it shuts down gracefully. So we PyGame.initialize, create our clock object, a reference to our clock object, set up a size for the screen, or we could have passed the tuple in directly, and give it a caption. Then create our infinite loop. The first thing is check for events. The last thing, set the frame rate. And after that semi-infinite loop, call the quit method to shut down gracefully. So that's everything we want to do, but we want to do this over and over and over again. So I don't necessarily want to type this every single time. So now we're ready for kind of the main theme of what this tutorial playlist is going to be about. Instead of typing this in, why don't we go create, this is just a text file. We just wrote a text file here. So instead of typing this in, why don't we just go set up the instructions to have the computer write this into a text file for us. And that's the main theme of what this playlist of tutorials is going to be covering. Having the computer write this file for us so that we can just ask for a couple methods and maybe eventually put it on a graphical user interface so that we can click things with our mouse, click and drag around with our mouse and have the computer write this .py file for us in the background. So let's see, it's about 12 minutes, so that initializes a 2D screen. So now let's go put a method together to have the computer write that for us so we don't have to type that over and over and over again. I'll see you in the next video for that.